I am Brian Kim at Hong Kong University Science Technology University. Yeah, let me start the session. So the title of this session is the Impact Evaluation Study on Health. Let me introduce first presenter, Jichen Deng. He's a postdoc fellow in Norwegian School of Economics. The floor is yours.
So first, thanks for having me to present in this very nice conference. This is joint work with my supervisor back in Amsterdam, and it has been a while. So we are trying to wrapping up the paper, and all comments is welcome. So it did a little bit different from the previous paper you have seen. So a lot of papers studying this workshop is RCT, and in this paper we're trying to leverage some policy policy program happened 20 years ago to identify the causal effect. And differently, we look at the intermediate or long-run effects. So the background of the study is the micronutrients like iodine, iron, zinc are essential for human growth and development. So we all know like mild iodine deficiency, especially for adults, can lead to goiter, which is the enlargement of the neck. This is inconvenient, but not life-threatening. So however, iodine deficiency during pregnancy can have serious problem for brain development of fetus. So for example, a lot of countries recommend pregnant women to take 220 microgram per day. So to give you some idea, which is, this is roughly like 3 cups of milk. For non-pregnant women, like we know, like it's not necessary to take that much of iodine. So because during the pregnancy, this iodine deficiency really have the consequence for human capital formation. So World Health Organization initial campaign to fight iodine deficiency with the salt iodinization at the end of 20th century. And right now, the most recent data I have is like 86% of households now have access to iodinized salts. Only 25 countries still has insufficient intake in 2015. So this is a dramatic improvement from 1993, which has more than 100 countries suffer from this iodine deficiency problem. So the knowledge of such program is not only for us to know how to implement in the future for other countries, but also give us idea about the pathway for these large resources distribution programs impact on later life, on health, on labor market, which are focused on existing study. Here we are more looking at the intermediate outcome for the school-age children. So to give you a preview of what we have done. So what we do is we look at the implementation of the USI program launched in China in October 1994. So since the turn on of this program, it never turns off. So what we do is we try to link this program with the pre-programmed geographic iodine deficiency rates to the new survey data in China. And what we do is essentially a different if we compare the cohort exposed to in utero with those slightly older unexposed cohort across province with high versus low based on iodine deficiency. So essentially we are trying to see those province with high iodine deficiency rate before the program catching up with those province doesn't suffer that much before the program. What we find is that we find strong effects on cognition for girls. 12% drop in goiter rate lead to 10% increase in cognition measured by cognitive test or years of schooling. So we find smaller and insignificant effects for boys. This is kind of common in the literature, but here we want to move a bit more. So because as the keynote speaker from the keynote speaker already mentioned that in China, there are widespread some preference. Parental investment differences might explain part of the differences. So what we do is we leverage some of the possible exogenous variation in some preference and run a triple diff estimate. We find that cognitive gains for girls are largest in areas where boy preference are strongest, which suggests that parents' investment might play some role in shaping these program effects. So to save some time, I won't skip literature. So basically, the paper want to link two literature. First one is a big literature about early life shocks, and we want to link this literature to the big another big literature with a gender bias. So to give you some idea of the background of salt iodinization, so Switzerland is the first country to introduce iodinized salt in 1922, and the World Health Organization adopted this policy as the main strategy in 1993, and China adopted this policy in October 1924. So before this universal salt iodinization, there are already some program like for some particular area, but this is the first time that all the, that's why called universal salt ionization, basically all the consuming salt is iodinized. And also a very important point is that the level of salt iodinization is not less than 40 microgram per kilo. This is kind of important because some European study look at reform in 1920s, which find no effects, because usually the program study in 1920s start with like a very low amount of the iodine in the salt and a gradual increase, which kind of make difficult for the identification. For our case in China, the level is I would say quite big, which is the upper bound of the World Health Organization recommended. And the advantage of using salt is very obvious, because salt is widely available and consumed in regular amounts throughout the year. And another advantage is the cost extremely low. So is even for developed countries, is not a big burden. So this is like kind of one product sold in China. And before, at the very beginning of the program, the World Health Organization worked with local medical teams to do the survey of the iodine deficiency situation in China. So in each province, random like measure around 1,000 school children to whether they have goiter or not. So the survey school children aged 8 to 10, and I plot the pre-program goiter rate. In this map, you can see that there are quite big regional variation. Even, for example, for some provinces close to each other, they have dramatic differences in goiter rate. This will be the first variation we want to explore. And another important point is there are no gender differences in this age in terms of goiter rate. So another variation we want to explore is the introduction of the policy. So every 2 or 3 years after the introduction of the policy, so the same team will visit those provinces and try to measure the goiter rates across each province. And what they find is, you can see that the goiter rate dropped dramatically. And also very importantly, that those provinces have higher initial goiter rate decrease more, which is very key to our identification. Basically means that all the province converging to the same level goiter rate after the program. So the identification is essentially a different diff. What we compare is we compare the cohorts exposed in utero with those slightly older unexposed cohorts, and across province with a high risk low baseline deficiency. And the parameter very interesting is beta 1, which is the coefficient of the STARMI post before the conceived before the policy or after policy times the pre-intervention goiter rate. And we control the fixed fact for birth province, birth cohort, and we include a large amount of control variables. So of the most important are the individual controls, like the age and family background, like education, and also mean reversion, because we know in this period, China's economy have experienced dramatic growth, and we want to make sure this is not our finding is not confounded by something else, for example, economic growth or decrease of the poverty. And in the end, we cluster all standard error by province, and we also try the alternative clustering. So the data we're using is China Family Panel Study, and we use two ways when put them together. We focus on the rural sample because we think that the urban sample probably will benefit from the additional information that might, the treatment probably will, the compliance rate probably will not as high as the rural sample. And we look at 4 different outcome: math test, verbal test, primary school, and years of schooling. And we restrict sample 4 years or 5 years before the intervention and up to 5 years after intervention. And we collect the birth information for our identification. And for those mean reversion control, we try to collect as much as we can. We collect hospital per capita, hospital beds per capita, and also poverty rates. Those are all measured before the intervention. And in the regression, we interact all these province variables by cohort to make sure that these will not confound our findings. So to give a quick idea of our estimates, so this is basically what we find. So you can see there are 2 dramatic differences. First is that there are quite big gender differences. So you can see males' estimates are also positive, but not is small, but not significant. The second is for females' estimates, they are big and significant, and is robust to all different kinds of clustering. And another very interesting point is that across, except this one, this is a dummy variable, except this one, all the other measures are very similar in terms of magnitude. So this is an event study to make sure that, because our identification strategy is different diff, we want to make sure that common trend assumption is valid. And we can see all that coefficient before the intervention are essentially 0, and there are no trends leading to until the year of the adoption. So we tried a lot of methods to identify, to make sure that our estimate is robust. And the last thing I want to talk about is the gender differences. We already see very big gender differences, and a lot of literature argue that the gender differences in terms of iodine deficiency is basically the female fetus are more sensitive to iodine deficiency. So as we know, like from the keynote speaker, we already know that like parental investment probably, especially the son preference, is widespread in China, and we wonder whether this will contribute some of the gender differences finding in our evaluation of the program effects. So what we consider is this decomposition. You can think of this as a reduced form estimates, and the term B is a biology effect if the parents are not responding at all. And the last term is kind of behavior effects, is when the parents are responding to the endowment caused by the program. So
you have 2 minutes.
Yes, great, thanks. So ideally, we want to leverage some exogenous variation in tendency for parents to respond to this investment. So here we want to use these gender attitudes measures, which essentially is these 6 questions. What we do is because the survey also collect these 6 questions, response to these 6 questions, and we aggregate them at village level, and we rank these villages in terms of gender attitudes. So we want to compare that. What's the heterogeneity across these villages with different gender attitudes. So to keep in mind, the gender attitude, the larger gender attitude means more biased. Gender attitude means more bigger some preferences. So due to the time limits, let's go to the estimates. So essentially, we use the different diff setting, and we interact the gender attitudes on top of this different diff, which is essentially the triple diff. And we are interested in these triple interactions. So what we can see is that for females, so the bigger gender attitudes means stronger program effects, while for the males, because bigger gender attitudes means stronger sound preference, which means more tendency to invest on males, and we find the opposite, which suggesting that the gender attitudes also play some role in shaping the program effects. So to conclude, so this paper look at this USI policy, which is commonplace, happened in a lot of countries, has huge external validity, and is very cheap effective. And we find strong effects on cognition for girls. And this potential be a pathway of the long-run impact for income, which has been found in other countries, for example, in US. And we also try to explore a bit heterogeneity. We find cognitive gains for girls are largest in areas where boys' preference are strongest, which suggests that parents' preference are also playing some role in shaping this program of USI. That's basically my presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Perfect time management, and it's very nice and interesting paper. Is there anybody who has specific questions? Feel free to type like your questions on the chat box. I actually myself have two questions, like one question and one comment. So
yeah, please.
Yeah, if you look at the chat box, my question is that why you focus only on fetus, as iodine may have and should have impact on the brain development of young children too. So that
yes,
is another.
is a great question. So at the very beginning, we also want to try to identify there are two reasons why we are focused on the fetus. First, because this policy turned on and never turned off. So if, for example, if the iodine deficiency have kind of linear effects in the age, it will basically absorbed by our identification strategy, because we need to maintain this common trend assumption. We also control for the linear trend in different regions. So if this has an effect linearly in age, it will be absorbed. Secondly is also because our sample size is not huge. Like maybe it's interesting to explore, for example, in future, look at the census data, for example, census 2020. At this moment, probably they're already in the labor market, and we have more measures and big sample size to identify these age differences in terms of policy effects.
Right. And would it be possible to measure parental input directly?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We received several comments from a referee also about this. So unfortunately, this survey design doesn't allow us to measure the parent input, because parent input only measured for the half the sample, which basically are the younger sample. All the sample are like conceived after the program, so we don't have this pre and post. So we might consider using another old data set, but this other data set usually have the problem that only restrict to a certain region, not the whole country. So we are not sure whether we can really measure this, but this is really like something we want to do. Yeah, thanks for the comments. Yeah.
And Professor Kono have a question. What's the underlying mechanism? Why there's a higher improvement for girls where there's a
we are thinking like, especially in Chinese context, is like parents have very high expectation for the kids. So if they have some preference, they may expect the kids to perform well in the school. And this iodine policy kicks in the kind of boost the endowment, the cognition capacity of the children. So parents might think they don't need to like push the kids that much. They might, for example, put the invest on other dimensions. For example, so we actually find some evidence. For example, the boys are happier, so they get less stress So this kind of suggests that parents are shifting some of their investment, not pushing them to study hard. But for girls, if they have this they don't have a strong tendency to do the investment. So the starting point of those girls in cognition will be low. And as we know that this curve of the decreasing of the marginal production, so we expect that girls will benefit more from those policies.
Okay. Yeah, I think that part is very important to convince people why this is a little bit counterintuitive. So
yes, that's true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I feel
yeah, we have to wrap up. And thank you very much.